and that is where the story of the Nubian Pharaohs begins.
صباح الخير. طبعا دكتور دودسون اتكلم باختصار، يعني انا هقول الكلام اللي قاله بس بشكل مختصر. هو طبعا بيتكلم عن النوبه وعن الكتاب الجديد اللي عمله في الجامعه الامريكيه في القاهره اللي هو اسمه الفراعنة النوبيون في مصر. طبعا النوبه جزء مهم جدا بالنسبه لمصر، وطبعا بتمد مصر بالحاجات الاساسيه زي الذهب، زي الحاجات اللي هي الاستوائيه، زي سن الفيل والعاج والحاجات اللي احنا كنا بنجيبها من النوبه. فضلا ان النوبه طبعا بالنسبه لنا هي بتشكل الجزء الجنوبي من مصر والشمالي من السودان. يعني النوبه موجوده في مكانين، اللي هو جزء جنوب مصر اللي هي بنسميها، يعني هضيف من عندي، اللي هي بوات اللي هو النوبه السفلى، والنوبه العليا اللي هي كوش اللي هي موجوده في السودان. طبعا عندنا مقبره حوي ده اللي هو كان الفايسروي، اللي هو يعني الحاكم النائب الحاكم في كوش عن الملك توت عنخ امون. دي مقبره موجوده في غرب الاقصر، ومن خلال مناظر هذه المقبره بنقدر نشوف الحاجات اللي كانت بتيجي لمصر من النوبه. طبعا بحلول حوالي 1100 1050 قبل ميلاد السيد المسيح بدا نسميه عصر الانتقال الثالث. هو جاب لنا صوره هنا من الكرنك من معبد خنسو. بنشوف حريحور ده كان كبير الكهنه بتوع الاله امون في طيبه، ورمسيس ال11 اللي هو اخر ملك في الاسره.
So we have this situation around about 1050 BC when Egypt is no longer controlling Nubia. So what is going on in Nubia at that time? The answer is we are uncertain, and often the next couple of centuries are referred to as the Dark Ages of Nubia, because archaeologically we just do not understand what is happening. However, there are one or two things which suggest what may have been going on. For example, here at the site of Kawa, there is some inscriptions of a king called Iri, including this stela, and the name and the titles which are used by this king Iri, who is certainly not an Egyptian king, are, however, based on Egyptian royal titles of the end of the New Kingdom. So we think that Iri was one of the first independent Nubian kings after the withdrawal of the Egyptians. And what Iri is doing is he's modelling himself on the old colonial power, and he is using names which resemble those. And another piece of evidence from the same period is to be found here at Semna. This is at the Second Cataract, it's a bit south of Abu Simbel, and here in the temple here, this is in a fortress which is now lost under Lake Nasser, but this photograph from 1962 shows it in place. This is a temple built during the New Kingdom, but later on this inscription was added to it of a queen called Katimala. Again, she is not a queen of Egypt, but she uses Egyptian queen's titles, and she is probably to be dated to the same sort of period as Iri. We cannot say exactly what her date is, but the language of the Egyptian used in this inscription resembles that used in Egypt around about 900 BC. So therefore, we think that she is in that period. So the picture looks to be that after the Egyptians have left Nubia, a new kingdom comes into existence, produced by Nubians themselves, but their model for what a kingdom is taken directly from Egypt. And in many ways, it is typical after a colonization that the new independent regime will model itself in many ways on what the old colonial regime did.
طبعا هو بيقول في الفترة اللي هي بعد نهاية عصر الدولة الحديثة تعتبر فترة مظلمة بالنسبة لنا عن تاريخ النوبة. طبعا يعني حوالي زي ما قلت قبل كده 1100 حوالي 1050 قبل ميلاد السيد المسيح، لكن حوالي 1050 بيظهر عندنا مكانين مهمين، الأولاني اسمه كاوا والثاني اسمه سمنة. كاوا لقينا فيه انسكريبشن بتاع واحد نقش يعني بتاع واحد اسمه إيري، وإيري طبعا صور نفسه على هيئة الملوك المصريين القدماء، لكن احنا مش عارفين عنه معلومات كتيره. وعندنا في كاوا في سمنة المعبد في احد المناظر موجوده في سمنة اللي هي موجوده لكوين كاتيمالا، برضه ما عندناش معلومات عنها كتير، بس غالبا النقش ده بيرجعها لحوالي 900 قبل ميلاد السيد المسيح، لان عرفنا الكلام ده من الهيروغليفي. الجميل في الامر طبعا ان النوبه في هذه الفتره اصبحت خارج السيطره المصريه، لكن هم بداوا يؤسسوا لنفسهم سلطه او مملكه او حضاره، لان هي بتقلد حضاره المصريين القدماء. يعني هم خرجوا عن السيطره المصريه لكن اصبحوا يعني لهم سلطه خاصه، لكن هذه السلطه بنيت على النموذج المصري زي ما شفنا هذه الملكه اللي هي كاتيمالا والإيري اللي احنا شفناها قبل كده في كاوا.
Also from this period, we have a number of tombs which may belong to some of these proto-kings of Nubia. Here at the site of El Kuru. El Kuru is later an important cemetery for the Nubian pharaohs ruling in Egypt. But when you look at the plan of the site, there, before you get to the tombs of the Nubian pharaohs of Egypt, which I will talk about shortly, we have a sequence of other tombs, tumuli and other tombs. They have no inscriptions, but the archaeological material suggests that these belong to the period from the Egyptian withdrawal through to when the Nubian kings take over in Egypt. And one of these tombs may belong to a man called Kashta, who is really important because he is the first Nubian to control any part of Egypt.
طبعا عندنا موقع اثري مهم جدا في النوبه العليا اللي هي السودان اسمه الكورو، ده عندنا فيه عدد متميز من المقابر، بس ما فيش عندهم نقوش يعني عشان نعرف الملوك دول، بس اهمهم طبعا كاشتا، وده كاشتا هو يعتبر احد الملوك المؤسسين اللي جم مصر وبداوا يحتلوا مصر ويأسسوا الأسرة 25 ويتكلموا عن الحياة.
At this time, Egypt is in a bad condition. Look, we don't just simply have one pharaoh ruling in Egypt at this time, but we have a number of them. And this diagram on the screen shows some of the different groups. On the far right are the people who had been the kings of the whole of Egypt for some generations, the 22nd dynasty, but soon after 850, Thebes, modern Luxor, splits away as its own separate state, and it has a civil war. So there's actually even rival kings just in Luxor. And then we find another set of kings appearing in the southern part of the Nile Delta. So at this point, Egypt is collapsing. And as a result of this, the Nubians start taking advantage of this, and Kashta is the person who is the first one we know who actually expands his power into southern Egypt. And therefore, at Elephantine, the island in the middle of the Nile at Aswan, has been found this fragment of a stela belonging to Kashta. And we then know that he is also recognized as the ruler of Luxor by the fact that at Karnak an inscription has been found which is part of a list of the inductions of priests which are normally dated by the person who is recognized as the ruler of Thebes at this time. And in this case we have a year 1 of Kashta, so that we can say that Kashta is recognized as the ruler of Thebes.
طبعا الفترة دي زي ما هو ورانا كده على الجدول الزمني بنشوف الجزء اللي بيخص مصر، وعندنا جزء بيخص طيبة والجزء بيخص الدلتا، فكان في صراع وتناحر في هذه الفترة. حتى طيبة نفسها الأقصر كان في يعني عائلات متنافسة على هذه المدينة. طبعا الشمال عندنا تنيس، ومصر كانت في وضع سيء جدا من ناحية عدم الاستقرار السياسي، بنسميها طبعا اللي هي التشرذم السياسي في عصر الانتقال الثالث. طبعا كشطة ده أحد الملوك القرن الأوائل اللي هم يعني بنتعرف عليهم في مصر. لقينا له حاجة في ليفانتينا اللي هي جزيرة في أسوان في النيل بتذكر اسمه، وكذلك وجد له نص أيضا من الأقصر وبيذكر العام الأول من حكمه، فده معناه إن هو أصبح يعني معترف به كحاكم نوبي داخل مصر في هذا التوقيت في يعني بدايات الأسرة 25 في مصر.
So what seems to have happened is that the Nubians had gradually extended their power further and further north, past the Egyptian frontier, and by the late 8th century they controlled the upper part of Egypt. We're not quite sure exactly where the boundary is, but we think it's somewhere along the line. Unfortunately, we know no detail about how that takeover took place, but it seems to have been peaceful, because people who had been in the old ruling family at Luxor are the allies of the Nubians. So what happened is not quite clear, but by this time we have this control of them in the south. Then further north in Egypt we have a whole series of other smaller kingdoms. So Egypt, say, has been broken up into a number of smaller kingdoms, each of which is shown here.
ثم مصر في نهاية القرن الثامن قبل الميلاد يعني أصبحت زي ما حضراتكم شايفين متوزعة بين ممالك مختلفة، يعني إمارات أو حكام أقاليم. يعني هنشوف الجزء اللي هو البنفسجي ده بتاع مصر العليا، وده اللي دان بالحكم فيه للنوبيين، لأن كانوا هم حكام بتوع هذه الأقاليم اللي هي في مصر العليا على علاقة بالكوشيين، وطبعا مش عارفين الحدود بتاعتهم امتدت فين. لكن في الشمال عندنا زي ما حضراتكم شايفين كل الألوان المختلفة دي عبارة عن ممالك متنوعة بتتثارى على الحكم في الشمال، لكن الجنوب كان عندنا ده اللي هو تبع الحكم النوبي أو الكوشي، يعني غالبا لحد الأقصر كده الحدود بتاعته.
The thing which means that the Nubians then move over to take over the whole of Egypt, because initially they seem to be quite happy to just have the control of the south. But then the ruler, so this is the area of Nubian control, but then they have good relations with a kingdom which is around the Fayum area, based at Heracleopolis, or the Echnazia in Medina. But then this kingdom they have friendly relations with is attacked from the north by the ruler of the Western Delta. And at this point, the Nubian king is now a man called Pa, and Pa therefore has to come to the rescue of his ally in the north and sends an army to try and help his ally in the north.
احنا عندنا زي ما احنا شايفين الجزء اللي هو بتاع النوبيين كان في مصر العليا اللي حوالين الاقصر وممتده، وهم كانوا على علاقه طيبه بمملكه اخرى في وسط مصر في منطقه هيراكليوبوليس اللي هي هناس المدينه في بني سويف. طبعا هذه المملكه اللي هي بتاعت هناس المدينه هجمت من قبل ملوك الشمال، فكان بيا او بعنخي لازم يدافع عن هذه المملكه اللي هي في هناس المدينه اللي هي في بني سويف، فمن هنا بدا يعني الاحتكاك مع الشمال.
And we have the full details of what Pianchi does from this stela, now in Cairo, originally from Jebel Bartel in Sudan. And this gives the full account of what happens. And ultimately, it is quite a long story, but at the end of the story, Pianchi takes the submission of all of the various rulers in the northern part of Egypt. So here what we've got are the various kings. All these people are calling themselves King of Egypt, even though they just rule a small part of the country. And that submission is shown at the top of the stela here, where we have Pa, Pianchi. There is two ways of writing his name, unfortunately. and then the various people who are claiming to be pharaohs of Egypt but are actually just local rulers around the country.
طبعا احنا عندنا لوحه شهيره جدا بتاعه بعنقي او بيها موجوده في المتحف المصري في التحرير، وهي جايه من جبل برقل السودان. وهذه اللوحه هي اللي بتحكي لنا عن الوضع السياسي او الوضع المتردي والمتشرذم في عصر الانتقال الثالث في عهد هذا الملك اللي هو جاي من النوبه اللي غزا مصر. طبعا الملوك اللي ظاهرين على كل واحد بيدي لنفسه تايتل ان هو ملك مصر. زي ما احنا شايفين في القمه بتاعت هذه اللوحه بعنقي موجود، هو قاعد هنا، وعندنا اسر القرن الرابع ويبوت الثاني ولملود، فكل دول ظاهرين زي ما حضراتكم شايفين ان هم بيسجدوا لهذا الملك النوبي، فده في حد ذاته معناه ان هو سيطر على الشمال.
What's interesting is that having taken control of Egypt, because he's now gone all the way up into the delta, he does not get rid of these little local pharaohs. They continue to exist. He is just simply one of a series of local pharaohs. And this will not change until his successor comes to the throne. Pianchi is buried at El Kuru like his ancestors, and this is his pyramid. It's a very tiny pyramid, and the pyramid itself is actually now being destroyed, so all we can see is the burial chamber. But this is the first man who had control of Nubian, who had controlled all of Egypt, and this is his tomb.
طبعا بعنقي خلى هؤلاء الحكام او الملوك زي ما اطلقوا على انفسهم في مناصبهم لحد ما جه تبعوا في الحكم بعد كده كان الوضع مختلف تماما، لكن هو هذا الرجل مات ودفن في الكورو في هرم صغير كده، وده البقايا بتاعته. الكورو دي في السودان، هذا هو الهرم، بقايا الهرم بتاعه في السودان.
Now, it is Pianchi's successor who changes everything. So Pianchi seemed to have been happy to have been ruler of the south of Egypt and have some kind of acknowledgement from the little pharaohs at the top. However, his successor, Shabataka, has a different approach. And he comes back into Egypt. And although he allowed little local pharaohs to stay in existence, he is very much set up as being the most important of the pharaohs. And one of he allows most of the local pharaohs to stay in existence, but one of them, Bakenrenef or Bokhoris, who was a successor of the man who had started the whole thing by attacking from the northwestern delta, he is killed. According to legend, he is burned alive.
سو جه بعد منه شباتكا او شبيتكو اللي هو جه بعد بيا طبعا، وكل الناس سابهم في الحكم ما عدا باكر رنف ده اللي كان موجود في غرب الدلتا، ودي الاثار بتاعته اللي موجوده في المتحف. الراجل ده قتل، he was killed.
To show that he is something more important than these other little local pharaohs, Shabataka adopts a special insignia. Now, you know that the Egyptian pharaoh has a single uraeus, a cobra in front of his face. The Shabataka introduces a double uraeus. There's two cobras. In the picture of Shabataka on the left, one of those cobras has later been cut away, because after the Nubians left Egypt, their memory was not well regarded. But there is an example on the right there which has not been mutilated, so you see there are two cobras. And one cobra is for Nubia and one cobra is for Egypt. So he is stating that he is a king of both Nubia and also of Egypt.
هو بيسميه شباتاكا، احنا بنقولها شبيتكو او شباتكا، فهو بيقول طبعا ان هو ظهر بشكل مختلف عن الملوك المصريين. عادة ممكن المصريين بيظهروا بكبرى واحدة بس، حية تعبان واحد بس، ده عامل اثنين، فالاثنين دول بيدلوا على ان هو ملك مصر والنوبة. الملوك المصريين طبعا عشان بعد الأسرة 25 قاموا بتدمير هذه الآثار اللي تخص النوبيين، فشالوا الحية من دول عشان هو يبقى ملك بس على جزء واحد اللي هو النوبة. لكن عندنا منظر تاني اللي على اليمين ده بيصوروا بالتو كوبراز الحيتين على اساس ان هو ملك مصر والنوبة.
Shabbataka builds a number of things at Karnak, and one example is this chapel, which I've marked in red here. Although that is no longer in Egypt, that was taken to Berlin in the 1840s. He also builds other places in Egypt, for example at Edfu, where there are these blocks from a temple he built. Interestingly, once the Nubian kings start taking over Egypt, they do very little building back in their own home cities, and then put all their resources into building in Egypt.
هو طبعا ورانا منظر لمقصورة بناها هذا الملك في الكرنك، ودي اتخذت واتنقلت لمتحف برلين في ألمانيا، وعنده أيضا منظر من إدفو، وهم طبعا بنوا عندنا آثار، وكذلك بنوا في النوبة بلاد المصرية آثار.
Also, having taken over Egypt, the Nubian kings start getting involved in the politics of the Near East. Previously, the Nubians had no connection with Palestine, Syria, the Assyrians and so on, but now they are controlling Egypt, they come into connection with them. And the Assyrians have never heard of the Nubians. They are a complete mystery to them. And in their first interaction, the Nubian kings of Egypt, they decide to be pacific against the Assyrians, including in 706 BC, Shabbataka is recorded in this Assyrian inscription in Iran as having sent somebody, a Palestinian ruler who had escaped to Egypt from the Assyrians. He sends them back to the Assyrians. This is quite important, not only from the point of view of international politics, but also because we can date this event precisely because we have good dating for the Assyrians. So we know this happened in 706 BC, and it also allows us to put exact dates BC for PA, Shabbataka, and also then his successor, Shabaka.
هو هنا بيتكلم عن شبتاكا دوت، وده يعني طبعا في الفتره دي كان في يعني انتراكشن بين الاشوريين اللي هم في العراق والكوشيين، دول ما كانوش يعرفوا دول ودول ما كانوش يعرفوا دول، فحصل تفاعل، بدات النوبه تخش في الشرق الادنى القديم، وده منظر موجود في ايران. عملوا شبتاكا بيصور في احد الملوك الاشوريين، وهو في النص بيقول ان هو كان في احد الفلسطينيين بعثوا تاني للاشوريين. وطبعا من خلال هذه التاريخ اللي هو بيتكلم اللي هو 706 اللي هو 706 قبل الميلاد، بدانا نعمل الكرونولوجي التتابع الزمني بتاع بيا وشبتاكا وشباكا اللي هم الملوك الكوشيين.
Shabbataka, although he had built things in Egypt, went back home to be buried, and this is the remains of his pyramid at El Kuru. But once again, the pyramid is now destroyed, and all that we can see is the open to the air substructure of the pyramid. And here we can see the evolution of the pyramids at El Kuru. Starting off, they're getting larger, and then in the next reign after Shabbataka, Shabaka actually has his burial chamber cut out of the rock rather than a pit covered over with blocks.
زي الصورة اللي فاتت بتورينا الهرم بتاع شبتاكا، البقايا بتاعته اللي موجودة في الكورو وأيضا في السودان، وبنى آثار في مصر، لكن لما رجع بلده بنى هذه المقبرة. والأشكال اللي عندنا بتورينا تتابع بناء الأهرامات الكورو 17 بيا و18 شبتاكا، بنصل إلى 15 اللي هي الشباكة.
The next king is Shabaka, and he changes the policy of Egypt-Nubia compared to the Assyrians. They say that Shabbataka had sent a refugee from the Assyrians back to the Assyrians. But now Shabaka responds to appeals for help from the various Palestinian cities which were being threatened by the Assyrians, including sending an army which in 701 BC helps stop the Assyrians capturing Jerusalem.
في 701 قبل الميلاد شبكة ده دخل في الصراع طبعا بين الفلسطينيين وبين الأشوريين، فأرسل جيش للدفاع عن المدن الفلسطينية اللي كان بيهاجمها الآشوريين في ذلك التوقيت.
Unfortunately, we do not know the detail of how the Egyptian Nubian army helped stop the Assyrians, but there is clearly contact then between the Nubian kings and Assyria, and there is this seal impression which has been found in an Assyrian archive, and this seal impression shows Shabaka, and therefore some kind of document or gift was transferred to Assyria. Whether this was some kind of peace treaty or some other kind of relationship, we don't know. But it is quite clear that in contrast to what was happening under Shabaka, Shabaka is keen to be involved directly in the politics of the world through Palestine, Syria, into Iraq as well.
دي طبعة ختم عثرت عليها في سوريا اللي عند الأشوريين، بتصور شبكة موجود زي ما حضراتكم شايفين بيضرب، فده بيأكد على القصة اللي حصلت من خلال إن هو أرسل جيش مصري نوبي للوقوف في وجه الأشوريين عند مهاجمة المدن الفلسطينية، لكن احنا مش عارفين بالظبط ايه اللي كان حاصل. دي الصورة اللي جات لنا، وربما ده حصل بيس تريتي حصل بينهم بعض، يعني انهم معاهدة سلام بين الأشوريين وبين النوبيين، بس هو طبعا لعب دور متميز في الشأن الدولي في اللي هو في الشرق الأدنى القديم عن اللي هو سلقه اللي هو شبكة.
The reign of Shabaka is one of the best known of this series of Nubian kings in Egypt, and one of the things which he does is he is very interested in linking his regime with the very remote past. So this object in the British Museum in London is called the Shabaka stone, and what the inscription says it is a copy of a very ancient papyrus which was found being eaten by worms, and it was then transcribed into hieroglyphs onto this stone to preserve it. And this is part of a much wider thing at this period of Egyptian history of going to the remote past to try and validate the regime. I think because of the collapse, this breaking of Egypt into multiple kingdoms, there's a desire to somehow link the country back into the glorious past of when the pyramids were built. And so we find in art, in inscriptions, and even in the way that the Egyptian royal names are written, an attempt to link themselves back to 1,000, 2,000 years earlier, to link themselves to the great past.
الحجر اللي قدامنا ده اسمه حجر شبكة أو شبكة ستون، ده موجود في المتحف البريطاني في لندن، وده من ضمن الآثار الشهيرة من عهد هذا الملك. والملك ده تحديدا وملوك هذه الأسرة ربطوا نفسهم بالماضي المجيد في مصر القديمة، ورجعوا للعصور اللي هي المزدهرة مثلا 1000 سنة أو 2000 سنة قبل كده، حتى أسماء الملوك بتاعتهم كانت مرتبطة بهؤلاء الملوك. وهذا الحجر بيسجل عندنا مذهب اسمه مذهب منف، ده مذهب خلق في مصر القديمة، كان مكتوب الموضوع على بردية، هو خد الحاجة ونقش على الحجر، وده وجد في مصر ثم انتقل للمتحف البريطاني، وهذا بنسميه احنا مذهب منف في الخلق بتاع الإله بتاعه، وده من ضمن الآثار الشهيرة التي ترجع لهذه الفترة. وكل ملوك هذا العصر ربطوا نفسهم حاجة بنسميها بالإنجليزي archaism، اللي هي العودة للماضي، كانوا بيقلدوا بقى الفنون والنقوش واللغة بتاعة العصور المزدهرة في مصر القديمة.
Shabaka also undertakes extensive building work, and we know of a number of monuments of his at Karnak.
هو عمل بناء كبير جدا، ومن ضمن الآثار الشهيرة بتاعته الموجودة في معابد الكرنك.
These works at Karnak are overseen by people who are members of the Nubian royal family. The high priest of Amun at this time is Hor-em-Achet, who is a son of Shabaka, and also the female head of the cult, because at this period there is a male high priest and also a female god's wife who are jointly in charge of the priesthood of Amun at Karnak. Aminiadis I is also a member of the Nubian royal family. In fact, she is a daughter of Kashta, the first Nubian who had control. And the building work which was carried out includes a new gateway of the temple of Ptah at Karnak. And also he builds a gateway inside the pylon entrance of the temple of Luxor.
زي ما شفنا في اثنين من العيله المالكه في السلايدز الاولانيه قبل دول. الامون اردس الاولى دي كانت الزوجه الالهيه للاله امون، ودي كان بنت عشتا. وكذلك عندنا الحور ده اللي هو الكبير كهنه امون. ف يعني العيله النوبيه نفسها دخلوا في كهنه اله امون. طبعا بلس ان هو عمل حاجات في الاقصر وحاجات في القرن، فده بيؤكد ان هم اهتمامهم بمصر وان هم كانوا يعني مندمجين في الانشاء.
This building of gateways to ancient temples is also to be found at Medinet Habu on the west side at Luxor. And this building of new gateways seems to be part of the Nubian kings' attempt to give themselves maximum publicity, so that if you erect a new gateway or add things like this, it means that the people will see your name rather more than if it were in a more remote place. And as we'll see shortly, the next king after Shabaka does this same kind of thing, is provide maximum publicity for himself by building gateways. So the first thing you see when you enter a temple are the names and images of the Nubian kings.
ده معبد مدينة هابو، وهو طبعا بنى بوابة هناك، ومهم جدا ان هو بيعمل البوابات دي لان البوابات دي بيقدم نفسه للمصريين بحيث ان فيها دعاية للملك الحاكم، بحيث ان كل الناس بتدخل هذه المعابد وتشوف الصور بتاعته وبتقرا اسمه، وهم قاموا بهذا الدور من اجل يعني ايه دعاية لانفسهم في اعين المصريين.
Shabaka, when on his death, is also buried at El Kulu, as had been the case with these predecessors. But as I said a little while ago, the tomb is slightly different in that the burial chamber is actually cut out of the living rock. And also, the tomb is decorated. Unfortunately, flooding has meant that all the paint has been lost from the walls, but enough traces remain to show that it is things like the Book of the Dead and some of the other traditional Egyptian funerary books. And we'll see a little bit later in the lecture an example of one of these decorated burial chambers which has not been destroyed by flooding.
شبكة طبعا مات ودفن في الكورو، والمقبرة اللي احنا شايفينها مقطوعة في الصخر، هي طبعا كانت فيها مناظر، لكن عند الفيضان أثر على هذه المناظر، ومن خلال هذه المناظر بنقدر نشوف كتاب الموتى الفرعوني وكل الكتب اللي تخص العالم الآخر. وفي إحدى المقابر طبعا باقي المناظر في حجرة الدفن فيها، لكن دي كانت متدمرة من التأجير.
Shabaka is followed by the most prominent of all the Nubian pharaohs, Taharqa. Now Taharqa had been a general in Shabaka's army, and we know from the Old Testament that Taharqa had been the leader of the Egyptian Nubian army, which had helped save Jerusalem in 701 BC. 9 years later, he becomes pharaoh himself. He is a son of Pianchi. We're not 100% certain whether how the succession mechanism works amongst the Nubian kings. It may be, we're not quite sure whether they use the same approach as Egyptian pharaohs or not. But anyway, and also what doesn't help is that we're not 100% sure of who the fathers of Shabaka and Shabataka were. But we are certain as far as Taharqa is concerned.
تهارقا طبعا احد اهم الملوك في الاسره الكوشيه، وكان جنرال في الحرب اللي هي حصلت الدفاع عن اورشليم او القدس في 701، وهو ابن son of بيانكي. هو ابن بيانكي اللي هو طبعا اللي احنا اتكلمنا عليه اللي هو اول واحد جه حكم مصر، وطبعا كان له دور مهم جدا وذكر في التوراة على اساس ان هو في دفاعه عن القدس في الحرب اللي احنا كنا بنتكلم عنها بتاعت الاشوريين من اهم الملوك طبعا. بس مش عارفين تتابع الملوك داخل الاسره النوبيه ازاي زي ما كنا بنعرف في مصر القديمه، فده الاختلاف يعني.
As I mentioned, the earlier Nubian kings had done very little building in their own home territory of Nubia. The main religious capital of Nubia at this time was Jebel Barkal, and we have building work there by Pianchi, but we have no trace of anything from Shabataka or Shabaka. This is changed, however, by Taharqa, who undertakes considerable building work here. One of the things he does is he builds a rock-cut temple directly underneath the tall piece of rock on the far left. And zooming into this, here we see the tall pillar of rock, which was believed to look like the head of a cobra, the uraeus of royalty. And at the bottom of this, he builds a temple. Part of it is built on ground, but also there is part of it which is built out of the rock.
طبعا جبل بركل ده من ضمن الاماكن المهمه، بيه اول واحد بنى هناك، لكن الملكين اللي بعد كده ما عرفناش عنهم الى ان جاء تهارقا، وزي ما حضراتكم شايفين ورانا الجزء الصخري الكبير دوت وبنى هذا المعبد. وعندنا الجزء اللي على اليمين ده عامل شكل الاوريس اللي هي حياه الكبرى اللي هي رمز للملكيه. جبل بركل من الاماكن المهمه جدا جدا في هذا.
Inside the rock-cut temple, which is known as B300, we have various reliefs, but also what we have here is this colossal statue of the god Bez. Now, Bez is a typical Egyptian god, but normally you never find him this large in Nubia. And one of the things which is interesting is that the Nubians take a lot of the philosophy of kingship from Egypt. They also take a lot of the religion from Egypt, but they change it. So therefore, Bez, who is simply a god of the household in Egypt, becomes a major deity with colossal figures in a temple like this in Nubia. Also, Amun is the chief god in Nubia, as he is in Egypt, but in Egypt, Amun has the head of a man. In Nubia, he has the head of a ram. So it's very interesting seeing how this sort of Egyptian prototype is taken by the Nubian kings to transform it into something which is more native Nubian.
طبعا داخل هذا المعبد اللي بناه تهارقا بنشوف الهيروغليف المصري وبنشوف المناظر بتاعه المعبودات، لكن اهمهم منظر الاله بس. ده مش بتاع عادل امام في الفيلم، ده الاله بس الحقيقي. تمام؟ فالاله بس ده يعني كان اله العيله في مصر القديمه، كان بيحفظ الاولاد والست اللي هي الوالده والكلام ده من الحاجات الشريره، لكن هو اتصور بشكل كبير هنا وده كان مختلف جدا. فزي ما النوبيين تاثروا بالمصريين القدماء في حاجات، بداوا ياخدوا الديانه المصريه لكن بشكل مختلف، ان هم كبروا حجم الاله بس. احنا ما بنشوفش الاله بس في المناظر المصريه بهذا الحجم الكبير، فضلا عن الاله امون. الاله امون بنشوفه مثلا في عندنا في مصر بشكل راس رجل يعني او انسان، هنا بنشوفه في النوبه بشكل راس كبش. فهو ده الاختلاف، فهم خدوا من الديانه المصريه لكن اظهروها بالشكل بتاعهم.
In addition to building at Jebel Barkal, he also builds at Kowa, where we remember we met King Iri from a couple of centuries earlier. And this is the site of the temple at Kowa. Now, this is not the remains of the foundations of a destroyed temple. It is the upper part of the walls of a temple completely buried in sand. At Kowa, it is probably the most sandy place I've ever seen. That sand just goes everywhere. So there are a number of temples here, all of which are filled up to the roof with sand. A couple of the things which were found here in this particular temple, Temple T, was built by Taharqa. There were a number of granite rams, the ram of Amun, and there's one here now in the British Museum. And also from the same temple is a small chapel which was taken away and is now in Oxford in the museum, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford on the right. But all of this is part of the very huge building program which was undertaken by Taharqa.
طبعا عندنا كاوا ده من ضمن الاماكن المهمه ذكرناها قبل كده لما اتكلمنا عن ملك إيرين من فتره سابقه. وطبعا تحارقة بنى هذا المعبد وده يعتبر الجزء العلوي من هذا المعبد الموجود تحت على اليمين. وهذا المعبد نقل لمتحف الاشميليان ميوزيوم اللي هو موجود في اوكسفورد. وطبعا صور نفسه على شكل الكباش ده موجود في المتحف البريطاني. بيقول المنطقه هناك دي فيها رمل كتير جدا والمعابد اللي كانت موجوده كانت مغطاه بالرمال. فتم يعني نقل هذا المعبد الى متحف الاشموليان او المتحف الاشمولي في اوكسفورد في انجلترا.
Taharqa also, of course, builds in Egypt, and he carries on the policy of Shabaka by adorning the main entrances to temples. So here we've got a plan of the great temple complex at Karnak, and I've highlighted here in red the gateways which Taharqa added to it. So you've got one on the north side there, you've got one on the eastern side, the southern side, and then the main entrance on the western side of the temple. He builds an absolutely gigantic entranceway, and here we can see it. These great columns, one of which has been re-erected in modern times, is part of the colonnade of Taharqa. So here, when you entered the great temple of Ammon, all around you as you entered, you were surrounded by these great columns belonging to Taharqa, emphasizing his position.
طبعا تهارقا زي سلف وشبكه بنى في الكرنك. بنبص نلاقي البوابات اللي موجوده في الكرنك في الشرق وفي الشمال وفي الجنوب وفي الغرب. لكن اشهر حاجه اللي هي القاعه الكومينيت دي بتاعت الاعمده اللي بتبقى منها العمود الشهير بتاع تهارقا في الكرنك. فهو كان برضو بناء عظيم في هذه الفتره وبنى هذه الاقطار المتميزه داخل الكرنك.
So for the first 20 years of Taharqa's reign, everything was going very well. So he was one of the most prominent builders for many generations. There are lots of other monuments. There are tombs of his officials. So a very, very peaceful, apparently a peaceful and prosperous country. And then the Assyrians come. It looks there is no evidence for any major problems with the Assyrians during the first part of the reign. Whatever had been agreed under Shabaka seems to have continued. But then the Assyrians, who by now had actually taken over all of Palestine, are right therefore on the border of Sinai, they then decide they want to add Egypt to their empire as well. And initially they are unsuccessful, but then they manage to get as far as Memphis. They capture members of the royal family, and Taharqa himself is wounded by arrows 5 times, and he has to withdraw from Egypt back into Nubia. And over the next few years there is some backwards and forwards things happening. Taharqa makes a comeback, the Assyrians come back again, and then Taharqa is finally driven out once more, and he goes off to Nubia where he dies. And for the time being, Egypt is controlled by the Assyrians and also various local rulers, including some of these mini pharaohs we've been talking about since the beginning of this period, who are now giving their allegiance to the Assyrians rather than to the Nubians.
طبعا في الفترة الأولانية من حكم تهارقا حوالي 20 سنة الأولية الأمور كانت تمام والأمور مستقرة، لكن إلى أن ظهر الأشوريين. فبدأ الأشوريين يهاجموا مصر. طبعا خدوا المدن الفلسطينية ووصلوا لسيناء وفكروا إن هم يضموا مصر ليهم، لكن في البداية هم لم يوفقوا ووصلوا بعد كده لمدينة منفو وخدوا بعض الأفراد من العيال المالكة. وتهارقا نفسه يعني جرح بالسهام حوالي 5 مرات، ثم ذهب ارتد الى جنوب بلاده، وكان يعني باك اند فورس، يعني رايحين جايين في حرب الى ان تم يعني السيطره الكامله من العشرين على مصر، وطهارها راح الجنوب ومات في الجنوب.
This is, however, is not the very end of the Nubians in Egypt. Taharqa, in the meantime, is buried under a pyramid, and something which is linked with his sort of power and wealth is the fact that he builds a pyramid vastly larger than any previous Nubian king. And in fact, it's so big he cannot be buried at the ancestral cemetery of El Kuru because there's no space there. So he moves across the river to a new site, Nuri, where he builds a pyramid as big as the third pyramid, the Menkaure pyramid at Giza, by far the biggest pyramid which has been built for many, many centuries. It's also very elaborate inside, that it has a rather simple chamber, it has columns, it has extra passageways, and also it has the largest number of Shabti figures ever found in a royal tomb, well over 1,000 of them. So, although his reign had ended in disaster for him, he is buried in the most magnificent tomb ever built in Nubia.
طبعا طهارقة اختار مكان جديد للدفن خلاف القور اللي هو المكان السابق بتاع افراد العائله الملكيه اللي هو النوري. بنى هرم كبير جدا يعني قارب في الحجم الهرم الثالث بتاع منكورع في الجيزه. وجد داخل هذا الهرم يعني عدد كبير من تماثيل بشابتي اللي هي التماثيل المجيبه اللي احنا عارفينها في مصر القديمه فوق ال 1000 واحد. بنلاقي ممر، بنلاقي يعني عامل حجره دفن متميزه، حجم الهرم كبير على الرغم من يعني النهايه المأساويه ليه والاسره. هذا الهرم يعتبر يعني شيء متميز جدا من فتره حكم هذا الملك.
The next king in Nubia was a man called Tanut Amun, who was a nephew of Taharqa and was probably the son of Shabaka. Now, when he comes to the throne, Egypt is apparently lost. But then he has a dream. This stela, now in the Nubian Museum in Aswan, and again from Jebel Barkal. There's a group of very important stelae were all found at Jebel Barkal in the 1860s. In this, he says he has a dream, which commands him to try and take back Egypt. And this is the account of his campaign back into Egypt, and he does actually manage to succeed in taking over Thebes, where he builds this little chapel at Karnak in his own name, but also linking his name with that of Taharqa to show that the Nubian power still continues. And he then ends up back in Memphis, where he kills one of the local kings who had been collaborating with the Assyrians. This is Nekal I, and Nekal I's son flees to Assyria. So for a very short time, Egypt is back under Nubian control, but then within a matter of months, the Assyrians come back, and they penetrate all the way down into Thebes, and they hand over control of Egypt to Psamtik I, who has come back with the Assyrians. And for the next few years, Egypt is controlled by this new king, the new founder of the 26th dynasty, Psamtik I, who remains loyal to the Assyrians for the time being.
آخر ملك عندنا في الأسرة اللي هو تنوت أمون أو تنوت أماني، ده يعني من أخت تباركا. هو طبعا ليه لوحة شهيرة جدا اسمها لوحة الحلم أو دريم ستيلا أو تنوت أماني أو تنوت أمون، موجودة في متحف النوبة عندنا في أسوان. بيحكي فيها الدريم بتاعه الحلم يعني. وفي هذه الفترة هذا الملك يعني أعاد السيطرة بشكل جزئي على مصر لأن وصل الأقصر. طبعا الأشوريين في هذه الفترة كانوا معينين حاكم يعني بنسميه فاصل هو الحاكم تابع ليهم اللي هو نيكاو الأول أو اسمتيك الأول. فهو قتله. فبعد كده جم الأشوريين ابنه بقى اسمتيك الأول ده هرب راح الأشور وبعد كده جم الاشوريين اشور بنيبال واحتل طيبه ودمر طيبه في هذا التوقيت، وطبعا انتهى بعد كده حكم الكوشيين، نزلوا للنوبه قانون اماني انتهى، وعينوا طبعا بسمتيك الاول كحاكم ليهم على مصر، ومن هنا بتبدا الاسره 26 وتنتهي الاسره 25.
So during this period, Thebes remains loyal to the Nubians. But then in 655 BC, even Thebes is taken over by Psamtik, and the country and Egypt is now reunited fully for the first time in many centuries. Because, as I said, even while the Nubians are ruling, there are local pharaohs around. This seems to have been done peacefully. A daughter of Psamtik is adopted to become the next god's wife of the moon, and the Nubians effectively then withdraw south of Aswan.
طبعا طيبه كانت ما تزال على ولاء الكوشيين في هذا التوقيت، وطبعا خضعت طيبه والجنوب لبسمتيك الاول في حوالي 663 او 665. هو طبعا كان الاشهر عندنا اللي هو 664 بدايه حكمه، لكن اعتقد 659 دي قعد حوالي كذا سنه يعني لحد ما سيطر عليها. فعين بنته بعد كده اللي هي زوجة الإلهية للإله أمون في طيبة، فهو كده سيطر سياسيا ودبلوماسيا على الجنوب اللي هو الملك بسمتيك الأول. ده بداية الأسرة 16.
Tanat Amun continues to rule in the south, and there he is buried at El Kuru. He is the last of the kings to be buried at El Kuru, and this is his burial chamber. And this is probably what Shabaka's burial chamber looked like, but it has been completely destroyed by water, but there's still something left of Tanat Amun's burial chamber.
تانوت أمون أو تانوت أماني نزل الجنوب ودفن في الكور، وهذه المقبرة يعني زي ما حضراتكم شايفين مقبرة جميلة أشبه بتاعت شبكة، بس بتاعت شبكة دمرت يعني بالمياه.
The Nubian kings never go back into Egypt proper, although there are some periods where the area up to Aswan is under Nubian control. But basically the Nubian kingdom is now restricted effectively to what is now modern Sudan. But the Egyptian influence continues, that they still build in pyramids. The art is still based on Egyptian art, although as time goes by, that art becomes more and more Nubian. More and more local parts come in. And that kingdom continues to exist until 350 AD, which is when the last pyramid is built in Sudan, and that really marks the end of the story of these people who had once ruled Egypt as the Nubian Pharaohs of Egypt.
طبعا النوبيين نزلوا للجنوب اللي هي بلادهم واستقروا هناك، وبنوا الاثار بتاعتهم على شكل الاثار المصريه زي ما احنا شايفين الاهرامات والمعابد في اماكن عديده زي النوري زي مروي زي نجا منصورات السفره. لكن طبعا بداوا مع الوقت يتحولوا للحضاره النوبيه ويعني يصبغوا نفسهم بالصبغه النوبيه، وطبعا يعني من حوالي 350 ميلاديه انتهت يعني حكم النوبيين واختفوا هذه الحرب.
This lecture has been very much a short summary of the story, and there is a lot more to be said about it, in particular how the Nubian pharaohs have been studied in modern times as well. And all of that is contained in this book, which was published in November by the American University in Cairo Press. Just to finish, I would like to thank everybody involved in inviting me here, Mr. Hamdan El-Kadi, also Dr. Hussein for all his help, also to the National Museum of Alexandria for hosting me today, and thank you all for coming along. It is always great to see people when I'm coming to talk here, and it's been lovely to come here in Alexandria. So shukran jazilan.
نختم بشكر المتحف الدكتوره هبه والدكتور اشرف والاستاذ حمدان الجمعيه المصريه لاصدقاء مكتبه الاسكندريه على تنظيم هذا الحدث الفريد، كذلك العبد لله يعني عشان وجوده جنب الترجمه. وطبعا كل الكلام ده موجود يا جماعه في الكتاب اللي هو عامله ذا نوبيان فيرس في ايجيبت، ده طالع في الاي سي بريس يعني الجامعه الامريكيه في القاهره في شهر نوفمبر اللي فات، وده طبعا حكى لنا قصه النوبيين ووجودهم في مصر منذ نهايات عصر الدولة الحديثة وصولا إلى الأسرة 25 وانتهاء بحلول الأسرة 26 وتحول مصر إلى حكم وطني تحت الفراعنة الصويين، وهو عامل كتاب اوريدي عن الصويين. شكرا جزيلا.
Okay, of course, we would like to thank Dr. Dodson, Professor Dodson, for this very interesting topic and lecture, and also thank you, Dr. Hossein, for this clear, extremely clear translation. And my apologies for Mr. Hamdan Al-Adi, didn't forget about your word. Please be invited to the stage, the manager of the Egyptian Association for Friends of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina.
The director.
Okay, so the manager, the director. He just
give you the certificate, so we're done with this, I think. Okay. Put it back. Just please be careful when you stop by. Or you can switch. Is this way to do it?
That's okay. Do this for you.
Thank you. Careful.
Yes.
You can move this a bit.
طبعا بشكر حضراتكم الساده الحضور القامات العظيمه اللي شرفونا والساده زوار المتحف. طبعا الاول بشكر صديقي العزيز الدكتور حسين عبد البصير على مجهوده في تنظيم معانا في تنظيم هذا الحدث والتواصل مع الدكتور ايدن دودسون. طبعا وطبعا سعداء بهذه الندوه اللي اتكلم فيها الدكتور ايدن عن الملوك الفراعنه في مصر، يعني سلط الضوء على جزء ممكن مش كتب كتير او فعاليات كتير بتتكلم عن هذا الموضوع. اسمحوا لنا في البدايه طبعا نشكر الدكتور اشرف القاضي مدير متحف اسكندريه القومي واللي اعتذر لظروف طارئه، نتمنى لوالدته الشفاء العاجل طبعا كلنا معاه. وبنشكر طبعا الدكتوره هبه والفريق
العمل طبعا
كله على مجهودهم،
الدكتور مصطفى وزيري والدكتور مؤمن عثمان طبعا الامين العام ورئيس قطاع المتاحف في الوزاره
اكيد،
وطبعا الجمعيه المصريه برئاسه الدكتور حسن حمدان يعني مشكورين جدا. نشكركم جميعا.
اسمحوا لنا نقدم زرع تكريم.
So he's thanking you and everybody who has participated in this occasion, Dr. Hiba, Dr. Ashraf, Dr. Mustafa Waziri, and Dr. Momin, and the Egyptian Association of Friends of Lives of Alexandria, Mr. Hamdan, and the whole team, and everybody who had the time and came over, Diane also, and the other two ladies at the
طبعا هناخد صورة جماعية
زي ما احنا الدكتورة ماجدة. everybody's here. Thank you so much. Hope that you enjoyed our talk today. Thank you.
هناخد صورة زي ما احنا بس هناخد دكتور هنقف في النص كده وحضرتك هنقف كل واحد مكان.
بس نفتح النور بقى عشان الصورة تبقى if you have a question please but I think ان الكهرباء هتقطع على الساعة 2. لو عايز اسئلة تحت امرك. if you have any question please Dr. Thank you.